makes Anor Londo go dark and why the sun there is an illusion, but it also explains a couple of other things as well. For example, if you think of it this way, Solaire's fascination with the sun suddenly makes a lot more sense. If we imagine that the sun in Lordran is a fake set up by Gwyndolin, then Solaire might never have seen the sun before he arrived in Lordran. This might also explain why it looks like nighttime in Darkroot Garden when it's daytime in the areas around it. The illusion just might not extend that far. There's also one thing which I find particularly funny with this theory in mind, and it's a line by Andre. At one point he says, "You won't make it through the night without employing my services," and then laughs. Now, of course, a lot of NPCs in the Souls games just sort of randomly laugh after every other sentence, but this can kind of be taken as a wry joke about the state of the world, because the night is never going to come to an end. I realise that I'm stretching here with this theory, and I don't think that this was entirely implemented in the game anyway, since when you kill Guinevere, the sun doesn't go out everywhere. I suppose the biggest hole in the theory is it also doesn't explain why the sun is present in the Undead Asylum. That line in the introduction really sticks out for me though, and I think it's possible that killing Guinevere was originally supposed to have much more serious ramifications on the rest of the game. As it is, the effects of the sun going out are limited to Anor Londo, and really what this does is just gives us a good excuse to fight Dark Sun Gwyndolin. This fight is one of the more unique fights in the game, if only because of the endless corridor that it's set in. I say it's endless, but it's actually not. If you're a slow character like myself, you can chase Gwyndolin all the way to the end to catch up to him. This isn't an especially challenging fight, especially compared to the other boss fight in the area, but I really like it nonetheless. It's very different from any other boss that appears in Demon Souls or Dark Souls, just because Gwyndolin keeps moving back the entire time. I think I'm in the minority on this, but personally I wish that they would use gimmicks like these in bosses more often. I will admit though that traditional boss fights probably hold up better under multiple repeat playthroughs, especially in a short period of time. Ultimately though, the core of the Souls games is really the overall experience, the feeling that you get when you're playing it, and I think boss fights like this evoke a different and interesting feeling. I think it's just a case that when I like a game, personally I don't tend to replay it all that much. I kind of save it and replay it every once in a while rather than jumping straight back in straight away, so stuff like this tends to come off a little bit better for me. As with many of the other bosses and characters, Gwyndolin also seems to have a pretty rough past. Thanks to his meek appearance, Gwyn decided to raise Gwyndolin as a girl rather than a boy. Basically, it gives the overall impression that no matter what Gwyndolin did, Gwyn probably didn't think too highly of him. Considering that he's guarding Gwyn's ceremonial tomb, I think it's safe to say that Gwyndolin probably still wanted the approval and the respect of his father, but I'm not sure that he ever got that from him. When you make it all the way to the back, there are fresh flowers on top of the tomb, so it seems likely that Gwyndolin brings flowers to the tomb every once in a while. There's also a chair here, so I get the impression that this is where Gwyndolin spends the majority of his time. This is an optional boss though, and he's kind of tucked away, so you might not even find him, and even if you do, there's not that much incentive to kill him. You can leave Gwyndolin alive and even join his covenant to invade people elsewhere in the world who have sinned. Overall, he seems like one of the more honourable characters in the game, but that doesn't necessarily mean his views align with that of the player character. Gwyndolin definitely wants to preserve the Age of Fire, the honour of the gods and the memory of his father, but that isn't necessarily what the player wants as well. Now that we have the Lord Vessel, it's time to pay another visit to Frampt. The more I play this game, the more I think Frampt might be my favourite NPC of them all. I like the way his voice walks a line between being very serious but also sort of absurd at the same time. Seeing such an important character fall asleep in the middle of Firelink Shrine is almost insulting, and listening to him get excited after bringing back the Lord Vessel is something I find funnier every time I hear it.
After 1,000 years, it is you. It is really you.
He's gonna bring me down to Firelink Altar so I can unlock the remaining areas. Not much to say about this, but it's a necessary step before we can move on. Thankfully, they made this a little entertaining with Framt's brilliantly simple character design. Having him hang upside down somehow makes him more menacing, but thanks to his whiskers, he's also even more comedic than before. He's just a head without a body or any clothes, but everything about him is well considered nonetheless. Quality doesn't necessarily come from complexity. There's 5 major routes available now, and the first one that we'll be visiting is the Duke's Archives. The first thing I want to point out here is that the entrance is another one of those obvious load times. You might notice that this corridor isn't in a totally straight line and has a couple of bends in it. That's handy because it means Anor Londo is completely lost from view, which frees up the memory for the Duke's Archives instead. The boars here are tougher than the one earlier on since they don't have a weak point, but once you kill these two, that's the end of them. You'll see when I kill this first one, the boar helm will randomly drop for me here. I have a personal vendetta against random numbers in game design. I think they're often used as a crutch where a more interesting mechanic could be used instead, but I suppose that's a rant for another day. Anyway, I'm pointing it out here because Dark Souls actually has a rather subtle compromise with regards to item drops. Drops are randomly decided for most of the game, but killing the last of any non-respawning enemy type will always grant its unique drop. In other words, if the boar helm hadn't just dropped for me, then killing the last of these boars would guarantee that the helm would drop. It's the same with the skull lantern from the necromancers and the symbol of avarice from the mimics. It's a nice way of mitigating the worst aspects of random drops. As long as you kill them all, you're guaranteed to eventually get the item if you want it. If you want the boar helm really badly, then the earliest point you're guaranteed to get it is here. That said, it is much better than not being guaranteed the item at all. This area sort of continues the visual theme from Anor Londo, but goes even further. It's by far the most ornate place in the game. It makes for a nice change of pace from the ruins that make up most of the other locations. I find that a lot of games are set in ruined environments, probably because it makes things easier from a design standpoint. It helps to explain a lack of friendly characters, and rubble makes for an easy way of railroading the player without it feeling too forced. It basically means if there's a door that they don't want the player to go through, they can just drop some stones in front of it, or if there's a floor they don't want the player to cross, they can just cave it in. You get the idea. It's nice that the Duke's Archives doesn't rely on this, but it does railroad players a little bit in other ways, with some needlessly convoluted staircases showing up later on. This is where we get some palette swapped enemies, which is just one of those unfortunate realities of games development you have to accept. It's much easier to just change the colour of the texture on an enemy than it is to build one from scratch, so if you're stuck for a new enemy, it's a very tempting option. Thankfully, they went a little bit further than usual here by sticking some outcrops on the enemy's back to give them a more crystalline appearance. This goes some way towards explaining why these hollows hit so much harder than the ones in the Undead Burg. Of course, ideally they would have some brand new enemies here, but there is otherwise such a huge amount of enemy variety that you can't really fault them for it. It especially makes some sense to have some basic undead types here because they wanted to include the channelers here as well. If they had bigger or stronger enemies alongside the channelers, then their attacks would probably be a one-hit kill if they were enchanted. I think generally they wanted to balance the experience so that players who put a decent amount of points into vitality aren't at risk of being killed in one shot, as long as they're on full health, even if they're wearing relatively weak armour. Dying to a single attack can be pretty frustrating, so I think they wanted to avoid that, which makes a lot of sense. Before your first encounter with Seath, it's a good idea to equip a Ring of Sacrifice since this is guaranteed to kill you. I can see why this would annoy some people, but I actually don't really mind it myself. It's one of those things that sets the Duke's Archives apart from other areas, and if you play the next area perfectly, you can get your souls back anyway. If you're really panicked, you can even actually walk back out of the fog door here as well. The smart thing about this setup is, after a little while, Seath will start spamming an attack with no cooldown, which eventually kills the player regardless of their health. The idea here was to make players feel powerless about their fight with Seath, but if Seath couldn't instantly kill the player, then that would be a pretty bad design choice. This stops players from wasting all of their resources fruitlessly trying to kill him. You can imagine someone might use up all of their humanity healing themselves if they got desperate enough, so the idea is to stop that from happening. Essentially, this ends up with the player being imprisoned, but of course you can still fight your way back out. I think it's great that they use this as an excuse to keep the player stuck in one area even though they can warp at this point. It manages to preserve some of that dread you get in other areas before the Lord Vessel, where you can feel trapped in your current location. Since you respawn at the bonfire, the guards don't have time to disarm you, and thankfully one of them is just resting here with the key. In this area we have some music being played on something that resembles a phonograph. It seems to be what makes the Pisakas aggressive, but it's easy to imagine it also being used for psychological torture or manipulation or something along those lines. There's another contraption in the center of this tower, but it's completely broken down. It took me a while to work out what this was for, but I'm pretty sure this was used as a way of rotating the staircase. There's a small gap between the steps and the wall, which is definitely intentional. There's even a little grating placed under each door so that people don't fall down. The way the books are laid out on the walls would make many of them very difficult to get to. Some of them are even placed directly behind the stairs themselves. If the staircase could move, then this explains both of those things. It's actually quite clever because even though this entire room is filled with volumes, you could rotate the staircase so that it lines up with any particular book. I have a hunch that this was initially intended to be a little gameplay element that the player could use to open up different areas, but ultimately it was dropped. Rather than remove it completely, the team just left a broken version of the device down the bottom. I don't really have any proof to back any of this up, but I'm almost certain of it anyway because it all makes perfect sense. The Pisakas here are what become of the maidens that Seath has kidnapped. It's not entirely clear whether there was something specific he wanted to do to them all, or they were just used for a different range of experiments. It is interesting that they've all ended up as the same type of creature, but that might just be what he does when he's finished with them. Whatever the case, it's a pretty horrifying fate, even more so since a couple of them seem to be aware of what's happened to them. At the end of this area, two of them will remain passive and even try to avoid you. If you listen carefully, you can also hear them crying. This is the kind of little thing which sets the atmosphere in Dark Souls apart from Demon Souls and Bloodborne. The Pisakas are the Dark Souls equivalent of the Mind Flayers and Brain Suckers, but they're a lot less overtly disturbing than either of those. Instead, they have a more tragic backstory behind them, which makes it more sad than horrifying. This is also where you can rescue Logan again. The Serpent Men probably recognised him as a special guest considering the cell he's in. Despite the danger, Logan doesn't leave the Duke's archives once he's rescued. There's too much magic here for him to pass up the opportunity. There's a nice contrast here between Logan and the Firekeeper corpse in this cell. The description for the Archive Giant Cell key says, "The giant cell once imprisoned countless maidens but is now empty save for a few key persons. They struggle to uphold their sanity as the horde of mistakes writhe at a fearfully close proximity." The corpse here is placed all the way at the back of this massive cell because the Firekeeper was afraid of the Pisakas and wanted to stay as far away from them as possible. Logan, on the other hand, is just sitting there right in front of them. He probably finds them more fascinating than repulsive. He could have just called to you from the back of the room like Griggs or Laurentius, but he doesn't, so this positioning seems like a deliberate choice and says a lot about his personality. Whereas most people would condemn Seath's actions, Logan admires him for his research. It's also worth noting that you don't get a special cell, so you're not considered as important a guest as Logan. Your character in Dark Souls is very rarely given any sort of special significance. Personally, I think it's kind of cheap that they put the key to get out of here so close to Logan. This means if you want to rescue Logan and get the Firekeeper soul, there's no way to avoid going all the way down to the bottom of this room, then all the way back out, then all the way back down again. To be fair though, this is probably the only really poor example of backtracking in this game. Backtracking done well is a good way for developers to maximize the amount of value they get out of their work, and I would say that Dark Souls is a good example of this overall. Usually if you need to retread your steps, it's because you want to see a blacksmith or talk to an NPC or something reasonable like that. Most of the time it's something that you could entirely avoid if you wanted to, or if you knew where you should be going. Of course, on a first playthrough you won't know where you're going and you will end up backtracking at least somewhat, but it rarely feels like it's the game's fault. This might be the key to doing backtracking well, making the player feel like it's their fault, even if that isn't always the case. Earlier on, when the music came on, the snake men fled to the top of the room, and if you look at this door when you're leaving, you can actually see scratch marks on it, which is a really nice touch. After this, we're back in the archives proper, and the next step is to open up a passage behind a bookcase. There's a couple of channelers here, and if you follow the direction they teleport, it actually leads you on the path you need to go. The first one here leads you to the first staircase, and then teleports to the opposite side to encourage you to spin the stairs around. Once you get behind the bookcases, it's the last area that you can speak to Logan. After you buy all of the magic from him here, he'll go hollow. I find it a bit strange that he goes hollow here since his goal has been to get to the archives. The other NPCs give the impression that going hollow is a sign of giving up on life, but Logan has enough books here to keep him occupied for many years. His dialogue implies that he starts losing track of time once he gets access to all these books, but I like to imagine that he has some trouble with the stuff that he's found. It could be a case that Seath's magic is too advanced for him, or maybe it's written in a form that he can't understand. Whatever it is that causes him to go hollow, his hollowing is by far the strangest in the game. He ends up in the room where you initially met Seath, and he's stripped off all of his clothes. His obsession with Seath seems to have caught up with him. At one point, Miyazaki said that Logan strips off his clothes to become more like a dragon. So yeah, not a particularly dignified end for one of the most famous sorcerers in the world, but some might say he deserves it. Outside here, the area is littered with golems. Sieglinde is imprisoned here inside one of the golems, and actually you can see her inside the big crystal on its shoulder before you kill it. The same is true for the golem that imprisons Dusk. You have to look quite carefully to see it, but you can actually see their character models trapped inside, and that's the place where they spawn from once the enemy is killed. It was probably a bit of a hassle to get that model in there, so I think it's nice that they went to the effort to do that. Just beyond these enemies is the Crystal Cave. Right at the start of this section we have a developer message which ensures that players will find the invisible walkways. You often find player messages here anyway, but it's important that they put a developer message here for people who are playing offline. The invisible pathways are an interesting hazard. Like most things in Dark Souls, they have a tell which makes them fair, the little falling flakes. A lot of the time when something is supposed to be invisible in a game, they tend to just make it faint and difficult to see properly, or put a distortion effect around it. So I like that they actually followed through on this and made the platforms completely transparent. What I don't like about this area are actually the visible walkways instead of the invisible ones. If you happen to stand in the wrong location on these, you can end up just sliding right off the slanted areas with very little warning or recourse. I've probably made it pretty clear by now that I think the level design in this game is really commendable, but there are a few slopes which could have been done better. Crystal Cave and the Great Hollow are the best examples, but there are a few others scattered around the game. Basically, it can be hard to tell just by looking whether or not your character can actually walk up certain ramps. Ideally, the distinction would be more clear. One way they could have fixed this is by being more strict about the slopes that are present. For example, if the maximum slope your character can walk up is 50 degrees, then any slope greater than 50 degrees should have been rounded up to at least 70 degrees. That way there's a very noticeable difference between slopes you can navigate and those you can't. In practice, I'm sure that kind of rule is very hard to enforce, especially if you want the world to look natural, but at the very least, the way the character behaves on a steep slope could have been improved a little. There's really no excuse for your character to just slide off with no warning. Off to the side in this area there's a ledge with a blue titanite slab, but it's quite tedious to get to. Apart from this section, all of the other invisible pathways are in a straight line, so usually once you find where it is you can walk directly to the next area. This one, however, has a couple of bends, which means you really need to rely on the prism stones to get you across if you haven't memorized it already. This is about the best excuse you're ever going to get to use the prism stones, and you can actually find 20 of them just outside the cave itself, but even so, actually using them is quite time consuming. The Souls games are known for rewarding patience, and there is a lot to be said about that, but I think this is taking it to an unreasonable level. At the end of this area we come across the clam enemies, but the sheer number of them placed here is a bit stupid. It gives me the impression that the team probably didn't get a chance to flesh out Crystal Cave as much as they wanted to, and ended up dumping a bunch of enemies here at the end to stretch out the time a bit. I think they're a pretty tough enemy with a good moveset and an interesting design, so I like them all individually, but I really dislike the area if they had just been scattered around Crystal Cave, as otherwise the place is quite sparse on enemies. There are some moonlight butterflies, but they remain passive unless you attack them first, so a couple of clams placed around the place would have kept things interesting. Seath is the first of the final bosses that I'll be fighting, but he's actually one of the easiest bosses in the game. If you just follow one of his front tendrils as he moves around, he has a pretty difficult time hitting you, so it's just a case of chipping him down over the course of a minute or two. There is also the immortality crystal that you have to break, but they place you right in front of it at the start of the fight, so to be honest it might as well not even be there. Even if you don't break it straight away, it's pretty easy to just run back and